The birth of a genius. Pisa, Italy, February 15, 1564. In a modest house near the Arno River, a child's cry pierces the cold winter air. This newborn would grow to challenge the most powerful institution in the world and rewrite humanity's understanding of the cosmos. His name was Galileo Galilei. You are watching Iconic Figures. Stay with us until the end to discover how this story shaped history. Galileo's father, Vincenzo Galilei, was a musician and music theorist, a man who believed in questioning authority through reason and experimentation. Vincenzo had challenged the musical establishment of his time, proving through careful experiments that the prevailing theories about harmony were fundamentally flawed. This spirit of inquiry would become young Galileo's inheritance. The Galilei family was not wealthy, but they valued education above all else. Vincenzo's experiments with vibrating strings and musical intervals taught young Galileo a profound lesson. Truth could be discovered through observation and measurement, not just accepted from ancient texts. As a boy, Galileo showed remarkable talent in mathematics and music, often helping his father with complex calculations. But the family's financial struggles weighed heavily. Vincenzo needed his eldest son to pursue a practical, lucrative career. In 1581, at 17 years old, Galileo enrolled at the University of Pisa to study medicine. His father's hopes were clear: become a physician, secure wealth and status, restore the family's fortunes. But Galileo's mind wandered beyond anatomy and healing. During a church service at the Cathedral of Pisa, something caught his attention. A bronze chandelier swung gently overhead, moved by a draught of wind. While others prayed, Galileo watched, mesmerized. Using his pulse as a timer, he noticed something extraordinary. Whether the chandelier swung in wide arcs or small ones, each oscillation took the same amount of time. This observation would later lead to his discoveries about pendulum motion, but in that moment, it awakened something deeper. The universe operated according to mathematical laws that could be measured and understood. Galileo began attending mathematics lectures by Ostilio Ricci, a teacher at the Tuscan court. These unauthorized visits revealed his true passion. Mathematics was not just numbers, it was the language of nature itself. He devoured the works of Euclid and Archimedes with fervent intensity. But when Vincenzo discovered his son's mathematical obsession, conflict erupted. Mathematics offered no financial security. Physicians earned gold. Mathematicians starved. Galileo faced an agonizing choice: obey his father or follow his calling. In 1585, financial pressures forced Galileo to leave the university without a degree. He returned home, seemingly a failure, with no medical credentials and no clear future. But in his mind burned questions that would not be silenced. Back in Florence, Galileo began giving private mathematics lessons to survive. He studied intensely on his own, developing new approaches to old problems. In 1586, at just 22, he wrote his first scientific work, a treatise on the hydrostatic balance. Inspired by Archimedes, Galileo had designed a precise instrument for measuring the specific gravity of objects. This work caught the attention of several prominent mathematicians, including Christopher Clavius in Rome. Galileo was beginning to build a reputation, but he needed more than recognition. He needed income. He applied for mathematics positions at various universities, facing rejection after rejection. The academic world valued ancient authority over innovative thinking. In 1589, a breakthrough finally came. The University of Pisa offered him a mathematics lectureship. The salary was meager, barely 60 florins a year, but it was a foothold in the academic world. At 25, Galileo returned to Pisa not as a failed medical student, but as a professor. His teaching challenged the traditional Aristotelian physics that dominated the curriculum. Aristotle had taught that heavier objects fall faster than lighter ones. a principle accepted without question for nearly 2,000 years. Galileo found this intellectually absurd. According to legend, he performed a public demonstration from the Leaning Tower of Pisa, dropping objects of different weights. Whether this exact event occurred remains debated, but Galileo certainly conducted experiments proving that objects of different weights fall at the same rate when air resistance is negligible. This challenged not just Aristotle, but the entire philosophical framework built upon his authority. Galileo's colleagues were not impressed. They were threatened. To question Aristotle was to undermine the foundation of their knowledge and status. The young mathematician made powerful enemies among the conservative faculty. In 1591, tragedy struck. Vincenzo Galilei died, leaving the family in financial ruin. As the eldest son, Galileo inherited the responsibility for his mother, siblings, and younger sister's dowries. The weight of obligation pressed down on him with crushing force. His modest salary at Pisa was completely inadequate for these new burdens. Desperate for better income, Galileo intensified his search for a more prestigious position. He wrote letters, cultivated connections, and presented his work to influential patrons. In 1592, opportunity arrived from Padua. The University of Padua, part of the wealthy Venetian Republic, offered him the chair of mathematics. The salary was 3 times what Pisa had paid. It was not wealth, but it was survival. At 28, Galileo moved to Padua, entering what would become the most productive 18 years of his life. The Venetian Republic offered something precious: intellectual freedom. Unlike other Italian states heavily controlled by the Catholic Church, Venice maintained fierce independence. Here ideas could be explored with less fear of religious persecution. Galileo threw himself into his work with unprecedented energy. He lectured on mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and military engineering. His classes became popular, attracting students from across Europe who heard of the brilliant professor who made complex ideas comprehensible. But lectures alone could not support his growing financial needs. Galileo opened a workshop in his home, producing mathematical instruments, compasses, and calculating devices. These precision tools were sold to merchants, military officers, and navigators. He hired craftsmen and ran what amounted to a small manufacturing business alongside his teaching. Money remained perpetually tight. His sister's dowries drained his resources repeatedly, yet in this pressure, his genius flourished rather than wilted. During these Padua years, Galileo formed a relationship with Marina Gamba, a Venetian woman. They never married, but together they had 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. Society's judgment of this arrangement mattered little to Galileo. Convention had never constrained his thinking. His personal life was unconventional, but his work was becoming extraordinary. In 1604, a new star appeared in the heavens, what we now call a supernova. This stellar nova created tremendous excitement and debate throughout Europe. According to Aristotelian cosmology, the heavens were perfect and unchanging. New stars were impossible, yet there it blazed, visible to anyone who looked up, undeniable evidence that Aristotle was wrong. Galileo gave public lectures on the new star to enormous crowds. He used the phenomenon to argue for the importance of mathematical analysis and observation over philosophical speculation. The old guard was outraged, but the public was captivated. Galileo was becoming not just a professor, but a public intellectual, a celebrity of ideas. Meanwhile, he continued his studies of motion and mechanics, conducting careful experiments with inclined planes. By rolling balls down ramps at different angles, he could slow down falling motion enough to measure it precisely. These painstaking experiments revealed the mathematical laws governing acceleration. Objects in free fall accelerate uniformly, their velocity increasing in direct proportion to time. This was groundbreaking work, but it remained unpublished, recorded in notes and letters to friends. Galileo was cautious about releasing his findings before they were absolutely perfected. He demanded rigor from himself that bordered on obsession. By 1609, Galileo Galilei had established himself as one of Italy's leading mathematicians. His reputation stretched across Europe through correspondence and his students' testimonies. But he remained frustrated. Mathematics was considered inferior to philosophy and theology in the academic hierarchy. He yearned for recognition as not merely a mathematician, but as a philosopher, a seeker of fundamental truth. Little did he know that an invention from distant Holland was about to change everything, a device that would allow him to see what no human had ever seen, a tool that would reveal the heavens' deepest secrets and set him on a collision course with the most powerful institution on Earth. The discoveries that changed the world. Venice, summer of 1609. Word reaches Galileo of a remarkable invention from the Netherlands. A Dutch spectacle maker named Hans Lippershey had created a device using lenses that made distant objects appear closer. A spyglass, a curiosity, a toy for merchants to spot incoming ships. But Galileo saw something more. He saw the universe waiting to be unveiled. Without ever seeing the Dutch device, working only from descriptions, Galileo set out to build his own. In his workshop, surrounded by lenses and brass tubes, he began experimenting with optical principles. Within days, he had produced a telescope magnifying objects 3 times, then refined it to 9 times, eventually achieving 20 times magnification. His telescopes surpassed anything being produced in Holland. In August 1609, Galileo demonstrated his telescope to the Venetian Senate from the top of St. Mark's Campanile. The assembled nobles gazed through the instrument in astonishment as ships appeared on the horizon hours before visible to the naked eye. The military and commercial implications were immediately obvious, and the Senate nearly tripled Galileo's salary and granted him lifetime tenure. For the first time in years, financial security seemed within reach. But Galileo had bigger plans for his telescope than spotting ships. On a clear night in late 1609, he pointed his improved telescope toward the sky, and what he saw would shatter 2,000 years of cosmic certainty. First, he observed the moon. According to Aristotelian doctrine, celestial bodies were perfect, smooth spheres. But through Galileo's telescope, the moon revealed itself as rough, mountainous, cratered, imperfect. He could see shadows moving across the lunar surface, proving the existence of mountains and valleys. Galileo made careful drawings and calculations, even estimating the height of lunar mountains. The moon was not a crystalline sphere, but a world, perhaps not unlike Earth. Next, Galileo turned his telescope toward Jupiter on January 7, 1610, noticing 3 small stars near the planet arranged in a straight line. Over subsequent nights, he tracked their motion, eventually discovering a 4th star, and gradually the stunning truth emerged. These were not stars at all. They were moons, orbiting Jupiter just as the moon orbits Earth. If moons could orbit Jupiter, then not everything in the cosmos circled the Earth. The Earth-centered universe was not the only possible model. Galileo observed Venus showing phases like the moon, cycling from crescent to full. This could only happen if Venus orbited the Sun, not the Earth, exactly as Copernicus had proposed. The Copernican model was no longer merely mathematical convenience, it was physical reality. He also discovered that the Milky Way was not a nebulous cloud, but countless individual stars. Working with feverish intensity, Galileo compiled his observations into a book published in March 1610, Sidereus Nuncius, The Starry Messenger. Written in accessible Latin, less than 70 pages, it detonated like an intellectual bomb across Europe. He named Jupiter's moons the Medicean stars in honor of Cosimo II de' Medici, strategically positioning himself for his next career move. The starry messenger became an instant sensation, spreading throughout Europe within weeks. Some celebrated Galileo as a new Columbus discovering worlds in the sky, while others denounced him as a fraud. Several prominent philosophers refused even to look through the telescope, claiming it must be a trick. But other astronomers with telescopes confirmed Galileo's observations, including the Jesuit astronomers at the Collegio Romano. In 1610, Cosimo II de' Medici appointed him chief mathematician and philosopher to the Grand Duke of Tuscany. Galileo could finally leave teaching behind with a generous salary and no lecturing duties, free to pursue research. At 46, he achieved the recognition he had craved, the title of philosopher, not merely mathematician. He returned to Florence in triumph, though leaving the relative safety of Venice for Tuscany, which was firmly under church influence. His friends warned him, but Galileo was confident that truth would prevail. In 1611, Galileo visited Rome and was received with honor by Jesuit scholars, with the Collegio Romano holding ceremonies celebrating his discoveries. He was admitted to the prestigious Accademia dei Lincei, Europe's first scientific society. Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, a sophisticated intellectual, became a friend and admirer. Galileo believed he could convince the Church to accept the Copernican system. He began writing letters, arguing that scripture and science could not conflict because both came from God. The Bible, he argued, taught how to go to heaven, not how the heavens go. This theological argument was reasonable but dangerous. A layman interpreting scripture was venturing into forbidden territory. In 1613, Galileo published his observations on sunspots, which further damaged Aristotelian cosmology and embroiled him in bitter disputes. The question of who discovered sunspots first became personal, creating enemies where there might have been allies. Galileo's polemical style, brilliant but caustic, made him admirers but also bitter opponents who resented his cutting sarcasm. By 1615, Dominican friars began preaching against Galileo from pulpits in Florence, with Father Tommaso Caccini denouncing mathematicians from the pulpit. Father Niccolò Lorini filed a written complaint about Galileo's letters on scripture interpretation, and the Inquisition began to take notice. In December 1615, Galileo traveled to Rome to clear his name and promote the Copernican system. He attended dinners and salons, demonstrating his telescope and arguing passionately for the new astronomy. But the political climate was treacherous. The Protestant Reformation had fractured Christian Europe, and the Catholic Church was in defensive mode. In 1616, the Church's theological consultants examined the Copernican theory and concluded it was foolish and absurd in philosophy and formally heretical. On March 5, 1616, the Congregation of the Index formally banned Copernicus's book, Until Corrected. Cardinal Robert Bellarmine summoned Galileo with a clear message. He must not hold or defend the Copernican system as physically true. He could discuss it as a mathematical hypothesis, but not as reality. Galileo received this admonition with outward compliance, but inner turmoil. The truth he had seen could not be spoken as truth. He returned to Florence, disappointed but not defeated, believing this was temporary. For several years, Galileo remained relatively quiet, working on other projects including studying comets and developing navigation methods. But the Copernican system remained his deepest conviction, a truth he could not abandon. In 1623, hope arrived when Cardinal Maffeo Barberini, Galileo's friend and admirer, became Pope Urban VIII. Galileo was granted 6 audiences with the Pope, who gave him permission to write about competing cosmological systems as hypotheses. Galileo began work on his masterpiece, Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems, Battles and Challenges. Florence, 1624. Galileo Galilei, now 60 years old, embarked on his most ambitious project yet. The dialogue would compare the Earth-centered and Sun-centered models through a conversation between three characters. Salviati would represent the Copernican view, Simplicio would defend Aristotle, and Sagredo would be the intelligent, neutral observer. Galileo worked on the manuscript for years, interrupted by chronic illness, pain, arthritis, and recurring fevers that plagued his aging body. Yet his mind remained sharp, and his determination unshaken. The dialogue was written in Italian, not Latin, making it accessible to educated readers beyond university scholars. This choice was deliberate. Galileo wanted to reach merchants, nobles, and literate citizens, not just academics. The book's structure as a dialogue made complex ideas engaging, with Salviati presenting powerful arguments that systematically demolished Simplicio's weak objections. The narrative structure made it painfully clear which side Galileo favored. By 1630, the manuscript was complete, and Galileo began the dangerous process of obtaining church approval for publication. He secured an initial imprimatur from Father Niccolo Riccardi in Rome, though the approval process became complicated and delayed. In 1632, dialogue concerning the two chief world systems was finally published in Florence. The book was an immediate success, selling out quickly and sparking intense debate throughout Italy with its brilliant arguments and elegant prose. But in Rome, alarm bells were ringing. Pope Urban VIII was furious when he read the dialogue and realized that Simplicio, the foolish character, presented arguments the Pope himself had made. Urban felt betrayed, humiliated, and publicly mocked by someone he had protected. The Pope was also under political pressure, with critics accusing him of being soft on heresy, making the dialogue a dangerous political liability. In August 1632, the Inquisition ordered the book's sale suspended. In September, Galileo was summoned to appear before the Holy Office of the Inquisition in Rome. At 68, suffering from multiple ailments, the prospect of the journey filled Galileo with dread. He requested delays, pleading illness with medical certificates confirming his poor health, but the Inquisition was implacable. In February 1633, Galileo made the slow, painful journey to Rome, not knowing whether he would ever return home. Galileo was allowed to stay at the Tuscan embassy under house arrest, but the psychological pressure was immense. The Inquisition was the most feared judicial body in Catholic Europe, and Giordano Bruno had been burned alive in Rome in 1600 for similar ideas. Galileo knew the stakes. The formal proceedings began in April 1633, with Galileo questioned about the 1616 admonition and his new book. The charge was clear. He had violated the explicit command not to hold or defend the Copernican system. Galileo's defense was that he had treated it hypothetically, as permitted, but the dialogue made his true beliefs transparent. The inquisitors were not interested in nuance. They wanted submission. Galileo found himself in an impossible position: recant ideas he knew to be true, or face condemnation. He was threatened with examination under torture, and though at his age this was likely a formality, the psychological torture was real. Isolated, aging, unwell, facing the full power of the church's apparatus, his friends and patrons unable to help. He was alone. On June 22, 1633, Galileo was brought to the Dominican convent of Santa Maria sopra Minerva for sentencing. Kneeling before the assembled cardinals, he heard his condemnation. The dialogue was banned, and he was found vehemently suspect of heresy. His punishment was imprisonment at the pleasure of the Inquisition and the recitation of penitential psalms weekly for 3 years. Then came the forced abjuration. Galileo had to publicly recant his life's work. Reading from a prepared statement, the old man renounced his beliefs. "I abjure, curse, and detest the said errors and heresies." He swore that the earth does not move, and the sun is not the center of the universe in a humiliation designed to be total and public. Legend says that, after his abjuration, Galileo muttered under his breath, "Et pour si muove," and yet it moves. Whether he actually said this is uncertain, probably apocryphal, but the sentiment was true. No forced confession could change reality. The Earth continued its orbit regardless of declarations. The trial and condemnation sent shockwaves through European intellectual life. In Protestant countries, the verdict was seen as proof of Catholic obscurantism, while even in Catholic lands, scholars were disturbed. René Descartes, working on his own cosmological treatise, immediately suppressed it, fearing similar persecution. The Church had won the legal battle, but was losing the larger war for intellectual authority. Galileo's imprisonment was commuted to house arrest. He would never again be free. Initially confined to the Archbishop's palace in Siena with his sympathetic friend Archbishop Ascanio Piccolomini, he was treated as an honored guest. But when Rome learned that Piccolomini was too lenient, allowing discussions and visitors, Galileo was moved again. In December 1633, he was allowed to return to his villa at Arcetri near Florence under strict house arrest, with no visitors without permission. At 70, broken in public reputation, his greatest work banned, Galileo faced his final years under constant surveillance. But the fire of inquiry had not been extinguished. Personal tragedies compounded his humiliation when his beloved daughter, Sister Maria Celeste, died in 1634. Her death devastated Galileo. She had been his confidant, and for weeks he could barely function, consumed by grief. His health continued to deteriorate, and his eyesight, which had allowed him to see what no one else could see, began to fail. The irony was cruel. The man who revealed the cosmos was going blind. Yet even in confinement and grief, Galileo continued to work, returning to his earlier research on motion and mechanics. If he could not write about astronomy, he would write about physics. In these final years, he produced his most important scientific work, discourses and mathematical demonstrations relating to two new sciences. The two new sciences were the science of materials and the science of motion, laying the foundations for classical mechanics. He presented his experiments with falling bodies, projectile motion, and structural behavior in rigorous mathematical revolutionary work. But how could he publish it when forbidden from publishing anything, and Italian printers would never dare? The manuscript was smuggled out of Italy to the Netherlands, where it was published in Leiden in 1638. Protestant Europe received Galileo's final work with acclaim. By the time the book appeared, Galileo was completely blind. The man who first saw Jupiter's moons could no longer see anything at all. He dictated letters and thoughts to his disciples, particularly Vincenzo Viviani, a young mathematician who served as his assistant. Galileo remained intellectually engaged even as his body failed, discussing mechanics and corresponding with scholars across Europe. His mind refused to retire even when imprisoned in darkness. Visitors occasionally received special permission to see the famous prisoner, including the English poet John Milton in 1638. They found an old man, blind and confined, but still sharp, still passionate about understanding nature's laws. The Inquisition continued to monitor him even in his blindness, and when students proposed erecting a monument, the Church forbade it. No honors were to be given to a condemned heretic. Galileo spent his final days at Arcetri, surrounded by a small circle of devoted students and assistants. He reflected on a life of discovery and persecution, triumph and humiliation. On January 8, 1642, at 77 years old, Galileo Galilei died. His passing was noted throughout Europe, though reactions varied wildly between mourning in Protestant countries and official silence in Catholic Italy. The Last Years and the Legacy Arcetri, January 1642. The man who had unlocked the heavens drew his final breath. Galileo's body lay in state briefly before a quiet burial in a small corner of the Basilica of Santa Croce in Florence. There was no grand monument. The church forbade public honors for the condemned scientist. For nearly a century, Galileo's remains rested in an unmarked location, his contributions officially suppressed. Yet even in death, he could not be silenced. His ideas continued to spread across Europe and beyond. Scientists across Europe, particularly in Protestant countries, embraced and expanded his discoveries. The telescope became an essential tool of astronomy, with observatories established and the heavens mapped with increasing precision. Every new observation confirmed what Galileo had seen first. The universe was far larger and more complex than ancient philosophy had imagined. In England, Isaac Newton was born the same year Galileo died, as if the torch of scientific revolution passed directly. Newton would build upon Galileo's foundations, synthesizing them with Kepler's laws into the universal law of gravitation. Newton's Principia Mathematica, published in 1687, acknowledged Galileo's pioneering work on motion and inertia. The physics of the modern world rested on foundations Galileo had laid. Meanwhile, the Catholic Church maintained its official position for generations, with the dialogue remaining on the index of forbidden books. But reality has a way of asserting itself. Catholic astronomers quietly adopted heliocentric models for practical calculations despite official doctrine. In 1737, nearly a century after his death, Galileo's body was finally moved to a grand tomb in Santa Croce. A monument was erected honoring him alongside Michelangelo and Machiavelli, Florence's greatest sons. 3 of Galileo's fingers, removed during the reburial, became relics, preserved as secular saints' remains and displayed in museums. Throughout the 18th century, the Enlightenment claimed Galileo as a symbol of reason's struggle against authority. Voltaire and other philosophers invoked his persecution as evidence of the need to separate scientific inquiry from religious control. Galileo became a martyr, not just for astronomy, but for reason itself, for the right to question, observe, and think. In 1758, the Catholic Church quietly removed the general prohibition against books teaching heliocentrism from the index. Specific books, including Galileo's Dialogue, remained banned, but the absolute position had softened. In 1835, Galileo's Dialogue was finally removed from the index of forbidden books, nearly 200 years after its publication. No formal apology was issued, but the silence itself spoke volumes. As astronomy and physics advanced through the 19th and 20th centuries, Galileo's fundamental correctness became undeniable. Telescopes revealed galaxies beyond galaxies, a universe of unimaginable scale, and Einstein's theories refined Galileo's principle of relativity. Galileo's assertion that nature speaks the language of mathematics became the foundation of modern physics. In the 20th century, as humanity sent spacecraft to explore the solar system, Galileo's observations were confirmed with stunning precision. Spacecraft photographed Jupiter's moons up close, the very moons Galileo had discovered with his primitive telescope. The lunar mountains he had sketched were walked upon by human beings, and Venus's phases were measured by robotic probes. NASA named its Jupiter probe Galileo, launched in 1989 to study the giant planet and its moons in unprecedented detail. For 6 years, the spacecraft orbited Jupiter, revealing Europa's subsurface ocean, Io's violent volcanoes, and Ganymede's magnetic field. The mission was a tribute spanning centuries, connecting the first observer to the modern explorers of the cosmos. In 1979, Pope John Paul II established a commission to re-examine the Galileo case. After 13 years of study in 1992, the Church formally acknowledged that errors had been made in condemning Galileo. Pope John Paul II expressed regret, acknowledging that Galileo had suffered unjustly at the hands of church officials. It came 359 years after the condemnation, but it was official recognition of the truth. Galileo had been right. But Galileo's legacy extended far beyond astronomy. He had fundamentally changed how humanity pursued knowledge. Before Galileo, natural philosophy relied primarily on logical deduction from first principles and ancient authorities. Galileo demonstrated that observation and experiment must be the foundation of understanding nature. His insistence that mathematics was the language of the universe transformed physics from qualitative description to quantitative precision. Every equation in every physics textbook traces its lineage back to Galileo's approach. His influence reached beyond science into philosophy and culture, raising questions still debated today about authority, truth, faith, and reason. The scientific revolution that Galileo helped ignite transformed human civilization within 2 centuries. Science revealed the laws of motion, gravity, thermodynamics, and electromagnetism, while chemistry and biology became rigorous disciplines. The Industrial Revolution, built on scientific principles, reshaped economies and societies worldwide. Modern medicine, engineering, communication, transportation all rest on the scientific method Galileo exemplified. Every smartphone, airplane, medical treatment, and understanding of why objects fall benefits from the revolution Galileo began. In education, Galileo's experiments became teaching tools, with students worldwide dropping objects and observing pendulums. These simple demonstrations connect learners directly to Galileo's insights, making abstract principles tangible. Galileo's personal story resonated across centuries. His courage in facing the Inquisition inspired dissidents and freethinkers. His perseverance, despite blindness and confinement, demonstrated that intellectual work could continue under any circumstances. Artists and writers found inspiration in his story, with Bertolt Brecht's Life of Galileo, exploring themes of truth, power, and compromise. These artistic interpretations kept Galileo's story alive in public consciousness, making him a cultural icon beyond scientific circles. In Italy, Galileo became a symbol of national pride, with his birthplace, home, and workplace becoming sites of pilgrimage. The Museo Galileo in Florence houses his telescopes, instruments, and preserved fingers, drawing visitors from around the world. Universities and research institutions worldwide bear his name, and the European Union satellite navigation system is called Galileo. Every GPS signal guiding travelers echoes the principle Galileo established: measure accurately, and the universe reveals its secrets. Galileo's methodology influenced far beyond physics, shaping modern judicial systems and the principle that claims must be supported by observable evidence. Truth determined by authority gave way to truth determined by evidence and reason, a philosophical shift Galileo embodied. Modern telescopes, from Hubble to the James Webb Space Telescope, are his descendants, revealing galaxies billions of light-years away. The search for life beyond Earth, one of contemporary science's great quests, began when Galileo showed that other worlds existed. Today, astronomers have discovered thousands of exoplanets, some inhabitable zones where liquid water might exist. In the 21st century, Galileo's story gained new relevance in debates about science, truth, and authority. In an age of misinformation, his insistence on empirical evidence feels urgently contemporary. Galileo's conflict with the Church offers lessons about institutional resistance to paradigm shifts that threaten established hierarchies. His story asks uncomfortable questions. Would we have the courage to defend unpopular truths? Would we recant under pressure? Galileo's scientific contributions remain foundational. His principle of inertia became Newton's first law, and his observations founded ballistics and modern physics. His telescopic astronomy birthed modern observational science, the practice of using instruments to extend human senses. In physics education, Galilean relativity remains a core concept, and his thought experiments became a powerful tool for theoretical physics. Popular science writing today follows Galileo's example. Explain profound ideas in engaging, comprehensible ways with elegant prose. Looking at Galileo's life complete, we see contradictions. He was brilliant, but sometimes arrogant, pioneering, but cautious, brave, yet ultimately compliant. These contradictions don't diminish his achievements. They make him human, a real person facing real dilemmas. Heroes in history are rarely perfect. They are people who, despite flaws and fears, accomplish extraordinary things. Galileo faced the most powerful institution in his world and refused to unsee what he had seen. The universe Galileo revealed was vast, governed by impersonal mathematical laws, yet understanding these laws meant humanity could work with them. Galileo's greatest gift was not just what he discovered, but how he showed us to discover. Observe, measure, question, trust evidence, think mathematically. In Florence's Santa Croce, Galileo's tomb stands adorned with sculptures representing astronomy, geometry, and philosophy. His legacy is written in every satellite circling Earth, every equation describing motion, every telescope pointed skyward. Galileo Galilei died under house arrest, condemned by the Church. Yet today, his discoveries form the foundation of modern science. The telescope that got him into trouble now studies the universe in wavelengths he never imagined, revealing billions of galaxies. 4 centuries later, we remember not the names of his persecutors, but the man who dared to say, "Look through the telescope and see for yourself." His greatest legacy is that invitation, extended across the centuries to each new generation. Look, question, measure, think, discover. The universe is waiting. This was another episode of Iconic Figures. Subscribe to our channel for more powerful documentaries about the minds and leaders who changed the world.